start. A very warm welcome to everyone. As some of you may know, my name is Monica Bohmduch, and I was the initiator and now the director of the Insiders Outsiders project that started life as a year-long nationwide arts festival expressly intended to pay tribute to the rich and diverse contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. It came to a slightly abrupt end in March last year, but the COVID lockdown led quite unexpectedly, I think, to a rich afterlife in the form of an ongoing program of online events, of which, of course, this forms part. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is held in partnership with the Czech Embassy, as you perhaps are already aware, also with the Ben Uri Research Unit, and indeed with Stevenson Art. Matthew Stevenson will be saying a few words in a minute. As I said earlier, you probably all know the way these things work sort of by heart by now, but if I could just please reiterate my request that you all stay muted. There will be a chance to ask questions through the chat function. Again, I'm sure you all know how that works, so do start typing in whenever you're ready. Addressed, I think, primarily, yes, to me, if possible. I think that's probably the best way to do it. The event will be recorded, and I will say more about that at the very end. What else? I think, that's enough. So I will now hand over to Matthew to just say some brief words of introduction to the Deputy Ambassador. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Monica. Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matthew Stevenson. I'm the founder of Stevenson Art. I work primarily with artist estates. Now, the Czech Embassy and the present ambassador, Irena Sedlecká, are very active in cultural events in the United Kingdom. And I'm pleased we are joined this evening by the Deputy Ambassador, Aleš Opatrný. The embassy has asked me to advise and help and organize 2 cultural delegations to the Czech Republic in recent years, which have resulted in projects and collaborations in the UK. So I was very happy to be asked to help organize this tribute to Franta Belsky and Irena Sedlecká, whose son Stefan Drexler and daughter Nora hopes to join us this evening. I would like to especially thank Monica and the Insiders Outsiders Festival for hosting this talk. The work the festival does is so important in recognizing the contributions of emigres to life and culture in the United Kingdom. Deputy Ambassador, would you like to say a few words on behalf of the embassy before we get started?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor and pleasure to greet you from the Embassy of the Czech Republic here in London. First of all, I would like to very much thank to the organizers of today's event. It's a pleasure to be here and see such a great and interested audience. Mr. Franta Belsky was without doubt the most important Czech artist living and working in London since the times of the graphic artist Václav Holár in the 17th century. Yet, until recently, Mr. Belsky's name was little known to wider Czech public. With this fact in mind, the Ambassador Libor Sedlecká and the whole embassy team is delighted to promote the profound legacy of this outstanding artist in the year of the 100th anniversary of Franta Belsky's birth. At the beginning of February of this year, we have started a campaign at our social media called Franta Belsky 100th Anniversary Artist Who Connected London with Prague. It was a campaign we did jointly with the Embassy of the United Kingdom in Prague. Throughout this campaign, Ambassador Sedlecká has personally visited 11 of Franta Belsky's works placed at public places in London and in its neighboring counties. Our British colleagues in Prague did the same with his works in Czechia. In addition, the Czech Republic and the embassy is planning to organize an exhibition of Franta Belsky's work, hopefully here at the embassy in June this year. And we would be, of course, pleased to invite you all to this event. Allow me to take this opportunity to thank to everyone who is actively participating on promoting Franta Belsky's legacy in the Czech Republic and in the UK. Namely, Mr. Stefan Drexler, the son of Mrs. Irena Sedlecká and stepson of Mr. Belsky. Mr. Peter Cannon-Brookes, one of today's speakers, and of course, Matthew Stevenson, our great ally, and Monika Baum-Duchen. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Belsky was an exceptional artist, and we believe that as of now, he will be remembered as one of the greatest personalities that have contributed to great and intense relations between the Czech Republic and the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to listening to our interesting speakers.
Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Nicola Baird, who is Research Officer at the Ben Uri Research Unit, otherwise known as BURU, attached to the Ben Uri Gallery and Museum, which many of you, I think, will be familiar with. But most importantly here today, curator of its, oh, what's happened here? Hold on. Nicola, are you screen sharing already?
Yes, was that?
Oh, fine. Okay, no, well, that's fine. That's okay. Let me just finish by saying that yes, her reason for being here is that she was the curator in 2019 of an excellent and fascinating exhibition called, as you can see on the screen there, Czech Routes to Britain, selected Czechoslovak artists in Britain. The works were in fact taken from Ben Uri and other private collections, including that of our main speaker today, Peter Cannon-Brookes. And as I mentioned earlier, I think she will be providing a wider context for Peter's more focused presentation on both Belsky and his wife, Irena. So over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Monica, for inviting me to speak at this special event. I'll be giving a brief contextual introduction to the contribution of selected Czechoslovak émigré artists to British visual culture, titled Czech Routes to Britain. Czech Routes, an exhibition held at Ben Uri Gallery in 2019, featured the work of 21 painters, printmakers and sculptors, many of whom fled to Britain as racial and political refugees from National Socialism, and marked the 80th anniversary of Hitler's invasion of Rump, Czechoslovakia on 15th of March 1939, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia's northern frontier, having already been ceded to Germany under the Munich Agreement of 29th September 1938. Nazi occupation resulted in mass displacement, and by December 1939, nearly 12,000 refugees from Czechoslovakia were resident in Britain. Of those registered with the Czech Refugee Trust Fund, a voluntary charitable organization responsible for refugees whose prominence in opposition to Nazism and fascism had brought their lives and even their liberty and even their lives into danger, and who therefore needed to be rescued, some 67% were Jewish. Britain became the center of the Czechoslovak resistance movement abroad, hosting President Beneš and the Czechoslovak government in exile between 1940 and 45, and as a result, numerous social and cultural organizations, including the Czechoslovak Institute. Designed to showcase Czechoslovak culture, the Institute was responsible for exhibiting the work of several of the exhibited artists, including Bedřich Feigl, Oskar Kokoschka, Frida Salvendi, and Geza Sobel, before closing in 1948 following Czechoslovakia's communist coup. Post-war, approximately 50% of the admitted Czechoslovak refugees remained in Britain, many of whom applied for naturalization. The exhibition showcased works drawn primarily from the Ben Uri collection, alongside external loans from private collections, celebrating the contribution of the selected Czechoslovak émigré artists to British visual culture, and highlighting their experiences, impact, and legacy. The museum's collection includes more than 30 works by 13 Czechoslovak artists, 11 of whom featured in Czech Routes. Painters and printmakers Yehuda Bakon, Jacob Bornfriend, Feigl, Leo Haas, Walter Hertz, Skylar Nikolska, Emil Orlik, Salvendi, Kata Strenitz, Walter Trier, and Schreger Weil. While portraitist and pioneering printmaker Emil Orlik made his first trip to Britain in 1898, meeting printmaker William Nicholson and recording his travels in numerous etchings, lithographs, and woodcuts, the majority of Czechoslovak artists exhibited, including Franta Belsky, about whom we'll be hearing more later this evening, Bornfriend, Dorrit Epstein, Feigl, and Trier made forced journeys to Britain immediately prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. In London, Bornfriend became part of a group of artists known as the Continental British School of Painting, which also included Austrian émigré and Czechoslovak citizen Kokoschka. His work was exhibited at German émigré Jack Bilbo's Modern Art Gallery between 1941 and 1948, and the Czechoslovak Institute in 1945, as well as by dealers Roland Browse and Del Banco in the 1950s and 60s, and the Ben Uri Gallery in 1974, where the artist's Prague series, reminiscent of work he was forced to leave behind in 1939 when he fled to England from Czechoslovakia, were notably included. In 1957, he was commissioned by architect Eugene Rosenberg to design a mural for Jews College, London, now the London School of Jewish Studies. His Jewish Festival series, based on studies for the Jews College mural, now feature in the Ben Uri collection. From the late 1950s, Bornfriend experimented with abstraction in dialogue with British abstractionists Patrick Heron and Peter Lanyon, using rhythmic patterns to convey a certain buoyancy of spirit and to capture the dynamism of abundance which he perceived in the British landscape. Graphic designer and illustrator Epstein, also known as Deck, immigrated to Britain in 1938 following the annexation of Austria by the Nazis. Settling in London, she took up a scholarship at the Ryman School, where she specialised in graphic design. She then joined the Women's Royal Naval Service as a radio intelligence officer, intercepting coded messages sent to German naval forces. After the war, Deck joined the design studio of what was to become the Central Office of Information, producing numerous posters for the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Works. A great admirer of the photomontageist John Hartfield, she often used collage in her design and advertising work for clients that included London Transport, British Rail, and the Post Office Savings Bank, as well as P&O, Penguin Books, and Tatler magazine. As a designer for the 1951 Festival of Britain's Land Travelling exhibition, she created the mural British Sports and Games, subsequently displayed in cities across the Midlands and the north of England. In 1956, she became a Fellow of the Society of Industrial Artists. She retired from graphic design practice in 1982, but continued to work as a painter and printmaker up until her death in 2014. Acting on advice from Kokoschka, who had known his gallerist brother Hugo well in Prague, and who was already in England, Feigl requested help from the British consulate in Cologne and was able to travel to London, settling first in Battersea, then Highgate, and finally in Hampstead. Although not featured in the Untitled Kunst exhibition of 1939, the Nazis considered Feigl's work degenerate. It was therefore confiscated and removed from public collections across Germany. In London, his work was exhibited at the Czechoslovak Institute in 1944, and most often within émigré circles, including at Ben Uri, where he was the subject of solo exhibitions in 1959 and in 1964, in celebration of his 80th birthday, and where he was also a member of the Arts Committee during the 1950s. Trier's illustrations were first published in 1909 in celebrated German satirical magazines Simplicissimus and Jugend, appearing alongside the work of well-known artists including Käthe Kollwitz and George Grosz. He became the regular press illustrator of Berlin-based Lustiger Blätter, and within 10 years was one of the most sought-after cartoonists in Berlin. Following the rise of Nazism, Trier fled Germany with his family, settling in England in 1936. There he was able to continue working, designing in the region of 150 title pages for the humorous monthly magazine Lilliput, as well as illustrating anti-fascist pamphlets for the British Ministry of Information during the war. In 1947, an exhibition of paintings by Walter Trier was held at Ben Uri, the same year in which he and his wife were granted British citizenship. Ultimately, however, they followed their daughter to Ontario, Canada, a few months later. This group of artists who made forced journeys to Britain immediately prior to the outbreak of the war also includes sculptor Anita Mandel and painter and printmaker Kata Strenitz, just two of the 669 Kindertransportees rescued by British humanitarian Nicholas Winton in 1939. Mandel came to sculpture by way of zoology and an intimate knowledge of the anatomy of animals. On leaving Dudley High School, she trained as a zoologist at Birkbeck College, University of London, before joining the staff at the medical school at the University of Birmingham. She was awarded a PhD in 1951, followed by a DSc in 1960. During this period, she attended evening classes in sculpture at the Birmingham College of Art. Based in Devon and still working at the age of 95, Mandel is a Royal West of England academician and Fellow of the Royal Society of British Sculptors. The majority of Mandel's sculptures are simplified animal forms with highly polished surfaces in which extraneous details are eliminated in order to enhance the beauty of the natural materials with which she works. Unusually for a stone carver, many of Mandel's pieces are also cast in bronze. Following difficult experiences as a refugee, including dairy and farm labour, Strenitz arrived in London to find that Mrs. Winton had sent some of her drawings to Kokoschka, upon whose recommendation she was awarded a British Council scholarship at Regent Street Polytechnic. Dissatisfied with the teaching, however, she committed instead to war work, making Air Force goggles, and moved into a Czech Refugee Trust Fund maintained hostel, where she met her future husband, Otto Fischl, a Czech Jewish journalist turned entrepreneur whose plastics factory, south of the old Caledonian Market, along with the surrounding industrial landscape, the railway tracks, tunnels, and bridges of King's Cross, was to become the main subject of her work for almost 40 years. When she ventured away from King's Cross, it was only to follow the Regent's Canal up to Camden Lock, to explore and sketch the back streets of Islington, or to find another rich source of industrial architecture amidst the riverside cranes and gantries of Rotherhithe and Bermondsey. Her fascination with such railway lands is attributed to her arrival as a Kindertransportee at London's Liverpool Street Station. In subsequent years, she received the Lord Mayor's Award for woodcuts and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Painter Printmakers. An exhibition dedicated to Strenitz's paintings was held at Ben Uri in 1961. Also represented in Czech Routes were works by subsequent generations of Czechoslovak artists, including Irena Sedlecká, who fled her country's totalitarian communist regime in the 1960s, and about whom we'll be hearing more shortly, as well as those who, between the 1970s and 90s, have made the positive decision to immigrate to Britain to study and develop professionally, namely contemporary multidisciplinary artists Teresa Beskova, Mila Festova, and Teresa Stelikova. In an article on the subject of the visual arts and Judaism, celebrated Czechoslovak art historian J.P. Hoden quotes Bornfriend's inquisitive response to the question as to whether the Jewish type, as a stylistic feature, also represents an element of Jewish art. Is there a Czech style, an English style, a Polish style? A rhetorical question of sorts, Bornfriend's retort reveals a distinct ambivalence towards generalization and classification by creed or country. Without wishing to tackle the subject of a Czech style at present, it is possible, however, to identify in a number of the works explored nostalgia for a distant homeland. These include Salvendi's Prague, included in the Ben Uri collection of paintings, sculpture, and drawings exhibition of 1946, a depiction of the Czechoslovak capital in a soft wash of muted colours. Nikolska's Sabbath in Prague, included in a solo exhibition of the artist's work at Ben Uri in 1975, the year after she immigrated to England, and in a 1998 exhibition, Czech Jewish artists from the collection, indicative of a kind of affectionate piety for a vanished world, rendered in ochres and browns, enlivened by white, yellow, and blue, and Feigel's equally engrossing The Restaurant. Inspired by the Slavonic atmosphere of the Czechoslovak capital, and reminiscent too of his Berlin days, Feigl returned repeatedly to the motif of coffee houses and restaurants, which he referred to as the marketplaces of life. Attempting to recreate continental cafe house culture in London, Feigl and others gathered at Cosmo, West Hampstead, perhaps the subject of The Restaurant, where one could spend all day reading over a single cup of coffee or consuming schnitzel and strudel with fellow refugees. Nostalgia is also evident in the work of contemporary artists Beskova, Festova, and Stelikova. Beskova seeks in her practice to celebrate and reinterpret Slavic as well as European rituals through the media of print, performance, and video. A series of 3 prints, produced as if they were postcards of the mythical town of Erdingtonia, commemorate her public art project, Clipping the Church, an ancient and almost forgotten English tradition as part of which families would flock to local churches, holding hands with each other in order to encircle it with open arms, by combining English customs with Bohemian wedding celebrations. Festova's Nest and Town Tree examine universal and personal mythologies. In the artist's own words, the technique of etching reflects and informs the spirit of her work, for as the image quietly grows, a fragile silver line emerges from a dark background as if a distant memory was traced from the unconscious. Both Nest and Town Tree, in its metaphorical depiction, perhaps, of Festova's Czech Routes, also resonate with the themes of identity, migration, and belonging. Similarly, in exploring how moving images can be used to capture and communicate both multisensory experiences, and embodied memory, artist and academic Sedlecká also enters into a cross-disciplinary dialogue with her contemporaries. Her photographs, which illustrate rail tracks, a collaboration between writers John Berger and Anne Michaels, chart an elegiac, introspective, and atmospheric journey by train through the wintry landscapes of southern Bohemia. Characterized by their liminality as well as by their haunting beauty, in evading exact periodization, such images function as mythic histories unbound by time. Whether forced or free, the routes these Czech-born artists took to Britain, as well as the routes they then set down, deserve to be far better known. Whereas the exhibition, and I hope this brief talk, have served to illustrate, their presence and their practice in this country have significantly enriched British art and culture, and continue to do so today. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Technical problems notwithstanding, most unfortunate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. I'll pick up now where I left off. I don't want to repeat and take up too much time by way of the introduction, but just to say that Peter Cannon-Brookes, from the early 60s onwards, travelled extensively in Central Europe, and particularly in Bohemia and Moravia, and is the author of an authoritative volume called Czech Sculpture, 1800 to 1938, which was published in 1983, among many other publications. And perhaps most pertinently here, he knew both Franta Belsky, I should say, not Belsky, Belsky, and his wife Irena personally. So over to you, Peter. And would you like me to start screen sharing straight away? Yes, okay, let's hope we have better luck this time. Right, a reminder of who's been behind this event.
Yeah. Now, can we have the photograph of Franta?
There we are.
Yeah, he's much more interesting to look at than me. Franta was born in April 1921 in Brno, and he was the son of a Jewish economist, Joseph Belsky, who I can find no information about at all, and perhaps somebody can enlighten me. He spent his childhood, however, in Prague, in the cosmopolitan Jewish liberal socialist milieu of the First Republic. And in 1938, age 17, with the reluctance of his father, he was admitted to a commercial art school in Prague. That only lasted a few months. And with the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, Belsky's family left in a hurry for London, where he enrolled in the Central School of Art and Crafts in London. The events were moving inexorably, and in September of 1939, of course, was the outbreak of the Second World War, and Franta enlisted in the Czechoslovak army in the United Kingdom. He was in France from May 1940, and with the collapse of the French, he returned to the United Kingdom via Gibraltar and arrived a month after Dunkirk. From 1943 to 1944, during the standing and waiting period, the Czechoslovak army shrewdly sent him off to the Royal College of Art for 2 terms, and working under Richard Garber. This was an important experience, and there he met Margaret Owen, who he married in 1944 before he left for D-Day Normandy. That was in 1945. He had service under Montgomery in France, and then was transferred to General Patton's army in South Germany as it entered Bavaria, and when they wanted Czech speakers prior to the Americans arriving in Czechoslovakia. And indeed, when peace came, he was demobbed in Pilseny. Next, please. Next, that's it. Now, this is the memorial to the Czechoslovak paratroopers, who together with the priests who took them in, were massacred by the Nazi forces after the assassination of Richard Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. I'm very curious about this because Franta Belsky had in 1945 entered the academy in Prague, in the sculpture school of Otakar Spaniel, and he executed this monument in Spaniel's studio. Well, there are several, this raises problems with me because Spaniel was basically a medalist, though he was also a jolly good portrait sculptor. But like all Czech sculptors during the Nazi occupation were unable to either work or teach. If you look at his Spaniel's record, there's a great gap between 1940 and 1945. I mean, this is an extremely mature work for a sculptor who was still only in his early 20s. And I think that it will benefit from a bit more research work. I think that Franta was probably Spaniel's assistant. Spaniel took on the commission and Franta did most of the work. But it is actually, I think, a very distinguished object. The following year, Franta made the medal of the, I'm holding it up next to me, of Emil Zatopek for the Czech army runners. And this is much more what one expects from a pupil of Otakar Spaniel. A rather distinguished object. Next, please. When Franta arrived at the academy in Prague in 1945, Irena Sedlecká, who was coming also from Pyřiny, she entered the school, and they were fellow students. But whereas Belsky was working under Otakar Spaniel, Irena Sedlecká was in the school of Karel Pokorny, a very distinguished sculptor who also had been silenced artistically, I think, throughout the previous 5 years. They forged a very close relationship, and in 1952, and I'm going to try and thread the two careers backwards and forwards during my brief words. She received the commission with her future husband, Ludwig Kodim, a fellow student, for the reliefs on the Lenin Museum in Prague and the monumental figures on the roof. The Lenin Museum is now, I think, an American nightclub or something, which is rather curious. And the monumental figures that she did with Kodim have turned up in the United Kingdom in a garden furniture sale. I tried to persuade the V&A to buy them and lend them to the London School of Economics. They do very well in the courtyard there, but oh no. Socialist realist sculpture is actually very scarce in this country. And that's where Franta Belsky's lesson comes in. So this was commissioned by the London County Council in 1955. The first cast is in Bethnal Green, which you see here. And the second cast we're familiar to Abingdonians because it's at the end of the precinct, having been given by Franta to Abingdon as a thank you for having for the British having taken him in 1939. Next, please. Belsky's Joyride, that was commissioned by Stevenage, Newtown, and is a particularly successful piece of what one might call social realism. And this was the local authorities liked Franta's work very much indeed. But of course, the modern movement was rapidly taking over everything, and no forward-looking local authority would, within a year or two of this, dare to spend public money on figurative sculpture. Very sad indeed, but I'm afraid true. It was the occasional commemorative sculptures where the figurative tradition survived. Next, please. Franta was something of an eccentric character. He relished being an oddball, of being independent of organizations. He rapidly fell out with the Royal Academy, for example. He hated art dealers, who he reckoned were parasitic, and they distorted the artistic development of younger artists. He managed to get, nonetheless, commission after commission, often for major pieces, on his own, without any intervention from artistic entrepreneurs and fixers, such as we know all too often the case today. This is his extraordinary monumental composition, Krieger. It's on the roof of Caltech's house, almost opposite Harrods. It looks actually rather well in this photograph. I passed it in a bus last year, and it is, I'm sorry to say, disintegrating. The construction again shows Franta's taste for novel materials and techniques. It is made from a steel armitage covered by wire netting, chicken wire netting, and then built up with cement and concrete on site. It's a big object, and then finished off with a metallic finish. It looks very impressive indeed, and it's a splendid composition. But whether it's going to see many more years, we can wait and see. We have this problem with several of Franta's large sculptures. His innovativeness in technique. I'm afraid Leonardo wasn't the only one. Next, please. Next. This again is this is 30 foot high, outside the Shell Centre in the South Bank in London. Again constructed on site with a steel armitage and wire netting and concrete and metallized surface. Nobody seems to know where it's got to. It's completed in 1961, but with the constant changes in the South Bank area and Shell moving out, fountain has disappeared. Franta wrote when his thesis when he was at the Royal College on his return from Prague in 1948, when the communist regime made it impossible for him and his English wife to continue to live in Czechoslovakia. When he came back, he entered the Royal College again, and he wrote his thesis on the design of fountains. And fountains become a very important feature in Franta's career, throughout his career. This I have strong memories of, probably for the wrong reasons. But that is that when the water comes cascading down, it looks splendid, but you'll get downwind from a strong wind and you'll get soaked. And I think that's the reason why Shell were not particularly happy to keep it indefinitely. Next, please. These large-scale compositions all look very different. I'm going to use a bit of slang at this stage. Franta is an art historian's idea of hell. The reason being that he looked very carefully indeed at the setting in which anything he was making was going to go, responded to it, he believed, to the public that he was going to see it, and so he came to a different stylistic solution to each commission. The people, this is in the Arndale Centre in Manchester, the people who commissioned things from him at least got a good maquette, but they were guaranteed to get something that was certainly different. And this was very, very successful. Again, I don't think it's still there. I'm open to correction on this one. Next, please. If I can now continue to fill in about Irena Sedlecká, because she produced more monumental sculpture in Czechoslovakia. In fact, after her graduation in 1950, she rapidly became, I think, in many ways, the most distinguished younger sculptor in Czechoslovakia. I mean, a major figure. And she produced the monument to the victims of the Nazi regime at Belsky in Moravia. And you wouldn't believe the trouble I had in finding the darn thing. It's huge, but finding it. Why? Because it's not on the town website, or at least it wasn't until recently. And it's not included in any books on Czech art. It's not included in the guidebook. And this is a major problem, which I feel certain our friends in the embassy are addressing. And that is the way in which Czech-born artists have been brushed out from the Czech art record. And it's very sad indeed. And so there's a big volume just been published by the Academy on Czech art, and 1,100 pages, and neither Franta nor Irena Sedlecká are even mentioned. And this I do find that this neglect of the Czech diaspora very sad indeed. Now, Franta was working in his studio in Kensington, and then purchased the cottage you see here on the upper image in Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire, only a couple of miles from where I'm speaking. And he built a studio, which is brilliant in design. I'll show you an interior one later on at the end of the lawn. And it was here that much of his later work was undertaken. Next, please. Now, this is Franta working on the bust of Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother. And it's beginning, it's part of his relationship with the University of Birmingham. He did a bust of Sir Arthur Thompson, the Vice Chancellor, in 1958, and the half-length figure of Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, was commissioned by the Board of Governors of Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham in 1962. And in many ways, it's one of his most important commissions, because it led to his long relationship with the royal family. He executed busts of no less than 4 generations of members of the royal family, and he has managed to capture Queen Mother's character, the mixture of softness and solidity that is you remember so fondly. Next, please. As I explained, Franta was determinedly anti-elitist, with a deep belief in what he termed as the social role of his sculpture. not surprisingly, his aversion to the art market and what he saw as its pernicious influence on artists, expressed with uncomfortable clarity and certainty, could be interpreted as arrogance. And his relations with the Royal Academy deteriorated beyond redemption. On the other hand, he had excellent relationships with his sitters for portraits. Here we have the portrait of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, modelled in 1979, and of Her Majesty the Queen, modelled in 1981. Now, there are two casts. The two other casts of these models are in the hands of Philip Mould at the moment, and having come up in this catalogue of the sale I organised in Oxford, and he hadn't noticed. I said, turn them round, and I said, what do you see on the back of the head? Oh, says Philip, Elizabeth. It's the only time I know of that Her Majesty and the Duke have ever signed themselves on the backs of their images. I mean, that is quite a tribute to Franta and his personality response. But these are both very good. These are from the National Portrait Gallery. These are the first casts commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery. And it illustrates so well the way in which Franta worked. He would start with a large egg-shaped piece of clay, probably with a core of polystyrene, expanded polystyrene and things on an armature, and then slowly build it up. And he build it up with smaller and smaller pieces of clay, working them, occasionally removing a bit, but working it out and up and up. And this process from the inside out, which is very much the training of the Prague Academy, of taking the bone structure of the head, first of all, and then the flesh and the muscles, and then, and I'll come back again to this later on, the subtle distortions that make it alive. I visited the studios of Madame Tussauds 2 years ago, and I could never quite grasp why I didn't like Madame Tussauds' heads. And they explained to me how they used photographic images and kept on working their things to tie it in exactly to a photographic image. And of course, if you do that, you don't have those subtle distortions that enliven, that convey character, and which are crucial to really high quality sculpted portraits. Next, please. Next. Yes, here's Franta working on the clay model of Her Majesty at a quite early stage. He describes himself how he would produce a kind of impressionistic treatment to start with. And he would deliberately use a rough piece of wood in his modeling and things, and only then start this building up to the final surface. Next, please. One of his most successful commissions was for the sculpture commissioned by the Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, in 1970, of Winston Churchill. Winston gave his famous speech that the Iron Curtain has come down over Europe at Fulton, Missouri. And they decided on the anniversary of the speech that they would have a sculpture of Winston Churchill outside the tower of the Wren Church, which had been bombed during the war in London and which had been dismantled and reassembled in Fulton, outside it. And Franta had a particular link to to Winston Churchill, because in 1940, before he left for France, the Czechoslovak troops that had assembled in the United Kingdom were camped out in Cholmondeley Park in Cheshire, and were reviewed by Winston. And there's some marvelous newsreel footage of Winston in his bowler hat reviewing the troops. Franta, who was already training as a sculptor, watched him very closely indeed, and he vowed that if he were ever able to produce a sculpture of Winston, it would be as he remembered him in 1940. So 30 years later, here is the maquette of Winston as he was, as Franta saw him in Cholmondeley Park. And it's next, please. And then he, as you can see, the same composition then is developed, worked up, and this is the over life size full scale clay figure before it's cut up for casting in bronze. Next, please. And there is the final figure in bronze before its installation outside the church tower in the university campus. He was asked later on, I think I just inserted at this stage, next please, to do a sculpture of Winston for the British Embassy in Prague, which is a very late work. When I was working on Franta Belsky's archive in the Henry Moore Centre in Leeds, there was a whole folder of letters and things to do with this commission. Well, it wasn't actually commissioned. I think he paid for it himself as a tribute, including the Churchill family, who didn't like it at all. Lady Churchill, Lady Soames, said that it was verged on a caricature, and she flatly refused to unveil it, which I think is sad. But in response, I would say that an element of caricature is essential in good portrait sculpture, and that brings out what has become the kind of hackneyed bulldog idea, but it does bring out the forceful character of Winston very well indeed. It's set against the wall just outside the entrance to the British Embassy in Prague, and so anybody can see it day and night. Next, please. But given the way in which Franta approached portraiture, there is very little stylistic or development. This is where when I was saying that art historians will despair, it's very difficult to date his bronzes. There are several decades between these two, Cecil Day-Lewis, 1952, and John Piper, 1987. Basically, his approach to portraiture is totally consistent, and he is one of the best portrait sculptors working in the United Kingdom before 2000. Now, in the meantime, next please. Oh yes, I want to address this one there. This is the portrait bust of Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Cunningham, in Trafalgar Square. Franta was very proud of the fact that this was the only sculpture in the principal London public spaces to have been executed by a foreign sculptor. That's no longer true, because we have at least one outside the American Embassy of Eisenhower, which is a pretty ghastly object, but it is by an American sculptor. There is the portrait tradition in the United Kingdom has been far stronger during the second half of the 20th century, far stronger than in any other country. And this is Admiral Cunningham, who commanded the Rodney and was sank the Italian fleet at Matapan. But like the Churchill family, I'm afraid the Cunningham family don't like each other. It's very impressive. I think it's better full face than it is from the side. Because of the high plinth, this is another problem with portrait sculpture. You must know the height at which it's going to be viewed. And if you're going to put it on a high plinth, as it's been done in Trafalgar Square, then you've got to take the foreshortening into account. This applies to wall sculpture, and lengthen the body and the figure. And you also have to tilt it forward slightly in order to make it fully legible. And the photographers don't always pay attention to those problems, and the result is not always entirely happy. Next, please. The last of Franta's important public commissions was for the monumental figure of Earl Mountbatten of Burma, overlooking Horse Guards Parade. And it's extremely difficult to get at it now because it's been corralled behind railings, and it's very sad indeed because it's actually rather a good figure. The interesting thing to me is that Her Majesty's government must have specified it very tightly, because the maquette done by Oscar Neyman for the competition for this figure, which is in the Oscar Neyman studio in Forest Hill, Oxford, is very similar indeed. I do not know who else went in for the competition. I don't think Ivor Roberts Jones did. I'll be coming to him in a moment. Right, that next, please. His last important commission was 1989. Now, in the meantime, Irena Sedlecká, with her second husband, did a run-up from Czechoslovakia with her 3 children and her second husband, Drexler, and came to London, and she she was met in London by Franta Belsky, and Franta did his best to help her to start with, and introduced her to the Society of Portrait Sculptors, and she became an important exhibiting member of the Society of Portrait Sculptors, and unfortunately, she also had 3 children. Drexler did a runner, and she says that she describes it as her wasted years from the time she arrived in the United Kingdom till she managed to get going. And it wasn't until after the death of Franta Belsky's wife Margaret that they began to see a great deal more of each other, leading entire to their marriage in 1985. 1989, next please. Now this is Irena Sedlecká's figure of Franz Kafka, which she exhibited at the Society of Portrait Sculptors in 1967. Stylistically, it is very different indeed from the social realism that I mentioned about her earlier sculpture when she was working with her first husband, Ludwig Kodim. This is, there's, I won't influence, but certainly it looks sideways to Giacometti, and she issued it in two sizes. This is the smaller of the two casts, 1967, and it is of really very distinguished quality. And in in 1967. In 1981, when the wasted years were over, she was involved in a project called Talking Heads. Now, this was an advertising ploy. The idea was to have a loosely modeled head, and then you put a gauze over it and projected onto that gauze a film of the person in question speaking. And it actually became more and more sophisticated and extremely successful. And of course, in order to have successful advertising, you need to have lots of well-known sitters filling their faces. And the result of this was that Irena rapidly built up an extremely distinguished and profitable clientele of portrait sitters. I mean, including in 1984, Benjamin Britten and Nigel Hawthorne and Paul Eddington, who we've been enjoying on television in the last few nights. And at the last likeness of Laurence Olivier, taken from life, which is executed in 1985. She was also responsible in 1987 for an important figure, Sir Frank Whittle, the inventor of the jet engine. I could go on interminably. Next, please. Here she is on the left-hand side with her maquette for Freddie Mercury. Now, Freddie Mercury died 19. Get this one right. Freddie Mercury died and in 1991, and she persuaded the pop group to commission an oversized sculpture of him. This was a long saga, and she became, I think it's fair to say, obsessed by Freddie Mercury, and from this obsession emerged this extremely striking figure. This is the maquette. Many of you will know or have known the fiberglass cast of full-scale figure, because it sat on the canopy outside the Dominion Theatre at the bottom of Tottenham Court Road for years and years. And I said to Irena, look, you must be getting some royalties off this. Oh no, she said, I let them have it free. So dear Irena was a very generous-minded and sometimes excessively trusted. Now, she was also working from the 1990s on a series of what she called My Little People. My Little People were the Great Actors and Singers series of small-scale sculptures, which had been commissioned for issue as in editions in coal cast bronze, so inexpensive, and for people who are enthusiastic theatrical supporters and musicians could afford to buy them. I mean, this used to be 50 years ago quite a popular thing. No music shop didn't have rows of little figures of famous composers and performers. They've all now vanished, of course. They have television instead. And this, for example, is Lucio de Lammermoor, with Joan Sutherland acting the part for the Great Actors and Singers series done in 1992. The Garrick Club has a complete set of these, so if you will wangle your way in there. Well, actually, I think they might be rather proud to show them to you. Next, please. This is John Gielgud as Hamlet from the same series, which I think personally is the best. So much so, I had it cast in bronze and hot metal for Caroline's in my collection, and it's really very desirable. 1993. Next, please. There, in 1996, you see that it took a long time for Irena to work on the figure of Freddie Mercury, and also extraordinary thing to us that nobody seemed to want it. And Freddie Mercury had a personal relationship with Montreux. He loved the place, and Montreux, when it was offered it, accepted it with open arms. I mean, really, it ought to be in London. It's an important figure, and it is a figure of very considerable quality. We really did seriously miss out on this one. Next, please. I feel sure many of you will immediately recognize this. It's the figure that was commissioned from her in 2002 of Beau Brummel, and over 1.5 life-size bronze in Jermyn Street at the bottom of the steps leading down from Piccadilly Arcade. And son Stefan, who I hope by now is watching, modeled the clothes. I have a lovely photograph of him in period costume. But historical figures are very tricky indeed, because on the one side, one wants to be as faithful as possible to the physiognomy of the model to make it as instantly recognizable as possible, and yet to give it that lively quality which I was explaining about in portrait sculpture. And Irena in Beau Brummel has achieved that synthesis with great fluency. And I'm sorry that she is not better represented on the streets of London. We nowadays have these ghastly footballer figures, which I can only say are a pity. Next, please. Now, with the arrival of Felix Dennis on the scene, Irena acquired her last great patron. And now that Felix is safely dead, because I wouldn't like to pursue, is not the easiest patrons, to put it mildly. And he has this Valhalla of heroes and villains on his estate in Warwickshire. And many of the offerings are perfectly ghastly. I don't think it's open to the public, but intermingled with the range of figures by mostly sculptors who are relatively little known, are at least two very important sculptures. The first is Irena's figure of Conan Doyle seated with the phantasmagoric figure of Sherlock Holmes rising up behind him. She took this inspiration, I think, from Czech sculpture in the 1930s,
She said she goes.
Oh dear. We seem to have competition. We have competition.
Right, Teresa, I think you've just joined us. Can you please mute yourself? You're causing interference. Thank you. Thank you.
And next, please. And the second major figure that Irena executed for Franta Belsky, for Felix Zenit, is the figure of Emily Dickinson. In this, I have actually quite a substantial role because repeated visits to the studio, she would bounce ideas off me. Emily Dickinson is a wonderful subject, but there are, at least we've never succeeded in finding any photographs of her that are not full face. And this means that she had to construct the side view of the head of Emily with a series of kind of tests. The result actually is extremely good. On the left-hand side is full-scale clay in the studio at Sutton Courtenay, and on the right-hand side there's Irena, which I took with her with the bronze when it's emerged out of the foundry. It's been sandblasted and is about to be patinated. And in the middle is a glimpse of the studio that she had shared with Franta until his death in 2000. Next, please. Yes, this is the studio. We recorded it in about 2010 before the sale. Next. Next, please. There we are. I conclude with the atelier sale, which was a considerable success. Yeah, but there are certain lessons to be learned from it. It was very difficult, frankly, to catalogue for the reasons I've rather pointed out. And I had to use Franta Belsky's archive in Leeds, things like that. Irena, poor dear, was suffering from acute mental state and was unable to provide any advice at all. So we had to pick up what leads we could do. And the sale prices raised demonstrated very clearly that if you want to sell a studio up, you must have a book about the artist in question, because Irena is as good a sculptor as Franta, but she didn't fetch anything like the same prices, and this was a disappointment. And next, please, last image. What I did my best to do was to produce a catalogue of the sale, which illustrated as many of the pieces as possible, and for the time being, it provides the only handbook of Irena's sculpture. Of Franta's sculpture, there is the book that he wrote some years before his death, but as Irena's sculpture, this is the only account available. And I'm working now on a biography of her, and we live in hope. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very, very much, Peter. That was wonderfully entertaining, wonderfully informative, absolutely fascinating. Many thanks indeed. Right, I noted that we do indeed have some questions and comments, so perhaps we should start with those. Yes, did Irena and Franta ever collaborate on projects?
Not to my knowledge. No, not to my knowledge. Well, except in as much as he would collaborate with an architect who was producing the pond in which his sculpture was going. Yes, to that extent. But he was a very independent soul.
Did he encourage?
One thing I didn't mention, which perhaps I shouldn't have, that's he got a major commission very, very early, and that was for the large bronze figure of Cecil Rhodes for BURU, which was unveiled by the Queen, and I suppose, is languishing in some public works depot somewhere in Zimbabwe. There can't be much of a market for sculptures of Cecil Rhodes at the moment.
Can you, apropos things that have disappeared, works that have disappeared, tell us something about the Festival of Britain commission? Because that was the very first public commission you received in this country, I think, wasn't it?
Well, that's what all sources say.
Mm.
And I had something of a coup this afternoon, and that I managed to find in our library the catalogues of the Festival of Britain.
Ah.
And I'm sorry to say that apart from the big names like Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, the minor figures, the up-and-coming sculptors, are totally unmentioned. Mm. So I drew a blank on that one. But the scale of destruction of the items that were in the Festival of Britain in 1951, I'm very proud of the fact I visited that exhibition and I remember quite a lot about it.
I can't help adding there, Peter, that as many of you will know, this year, this summer, in fact, is the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Festival of Britain, and there will actually be an Insiders Outsiders talk by Harriet Atkinson, who's published extensively on the festival, talking specifically about the disproportionate contribution, Peter, made by the former refugees to that landmark cultural event.
Oh, there are a whole string of them.
An interesting subject in its own right, absolutely. Well, Stefan Drexler, who's already been mentioned, Irena's son, confirms that there were no collaborations, but there was a lot of constructive criticism between them. So that's good to know. Let me just scroll upwards. There was a point of information. Let me just see here. Yes, about the shell fountain. By the way, because it's listed, the shell fountain is due to be put back in place in 2023 once the development is complete. So that's great.
How on earth did they move a 30-foot high mixture of steel and concrete?
No idea, but that seems to be happening. And also the Arndale, the question about the Manchester piece, the Arndale sculpture was actually damaged in the IRA bombing, the notorious bombing.
Oh,
never restored.
Not been repaired.
Never, yeah.
Has it not been repaired?
Apparently not.
Apparently not.
Apparently not.
I'd heard bad tidings, but didn't know why. That was the bomb.
And Stefan's also added that, well, I think you mentioned he modelled for the wonderful Brummel piece in Jermyn Street, but actually his wife Lucy modelled for Emily Dickinson, once again in full period period costume.
The Emily Dickinson is terribly Czech because it's based on the Božena Německá sculpture that Pokorny did in Prague. And in fact, Irena's hands were modeled by Pokorny for that figure. So the full scale figure in Prague has Irena's hands, and he gave to Irena the maquette for the sculpture. And so Irena had the maquette for the Prague sculpture when she was working on the on Felix Dennis's commission, and I have it in my collection.
Interesting. Stefan, I don't want to put you on the spot at all, but whether, if you would like to say a few words about your about your mother and indeed your stepfather, that would be wonderful. But as I say, I don't want to put you on the spot. Would you like to say something? If so, do unmute yourself and put your camera on. In the meantime, if anybody has any further last questions, last chance really to ask any more questions. Matthew was wondering just while Stefan's debating whether to become visible or not. Matthew was curious to know, Peter, how you actually met them in the first place. What was the original sort of encounter?
Well, I was introduced to Irena first of all, and then Irena and Franta asked me. That was when the Society of Portrait Sculptors was revived with Franta as president. That's when I met them both in the London exhibitions, and Tony Stones became president afterwards, and so I got to know that group of the SBS. And in fact, I'm meant to be the historian of the SBS. I'm still working on that one. And I attended their, I think I'm right in saying this, their wedding breakfast. was a very discreet affair in something called.
His first wife, Peter, was a talented cartoonist, wasn't she? Who actually used the name Belsky as her kind of trademark. Yes.
And in fact, when Franta was a student in Prague, 1945 to 48, she and he funded themselves, much of it, by freelance drawings for the Czechoslovak newspapers and magazines. There's a lot of work going for people in that way, and because I had close relations with Michael Ayrton, and he, after the war, was funding much of his lifestyle through doing drawings for the Listener, and there was a lot of work available for talented draftsmen.
Indeed. Now I'm aware of the time drawing on, and I think probably it's time to draw things to a close. Maybe I can just obviously thank you very much, Peter, and indeed Nicola, very much for your contributions. And also a reminder that the event has been recorded. It will be, what should we say, edited judiciously to cut out the embarrassing technical hiccups, and will be uploaded, not in fact directly onto the website, but actually onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you can find on Google pretty easily. And if I could just add that there are many, all our online events have been recorded, so it's a rather rich, though I say it myself, a rich sort of resource that you might like to spend some time browsing through. And I'd just like to end, if I may, on perhaps, well, a somber note, but well, as you've probably realized, we held this event today to mark the centenary of Belsky's birth on the 6th of April 1921. We also paid homage to Irena because she died, in fact, only last year. But we also chose to have it on this particular day because, as you may or may not be aware, it's not perhaps that well known in this country, that today is actually what is called internationally Holocaust Martyrs Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, as it's called in Israel, where it is indeed a national, sort of an important, not exactly a holiday, but it's an important day in that country. And one thing that we haven't mentioned, but which I think needs to be said, is that Belsky lost a great, I'm right, aren't I, Peter? Large number of family members perished in the Holocaust. And I was interested that you mentioned all Oscar Neman, again, another fascinating figure of Yugoslav Jewish origin whose family suffered a very, very similar fate. And I think, the risk of ending on this somber, but I think important note that in these extraordinary stories of achievement, against all the odds, coming to a strange land and, all the traumatic circumstances under which they came, this extraordinary contribution that so many of these creative individuals made to this country's culture, there is this dark, deep backdrop of profound loss and trauma, which perhaps in some paradoxical and ultimately fruitful way, spurred on their creative achievements. So apologies, as I say, for ending on that note, but thank you very much again, everyone, for being here, for your patience, and thank you again very much, Peter, in particular, and to the Czech Embassy, and indeed to Matthew as well, for being such sort of splendid colleagues on this project.
Monica,
just
Monica, I was just going to say, before you say goodbye, I see Stefan is actually ready to answer a question or to say a few words. I know you.
Oh, good.
Right, I'm sorry, Stefan, I missed that. Please, have you got your camera on now, Stefan?
Stefan, good evening. Thank you so much for joining.
Very nice to see you. Hello. Hi. Sorry if I didn't notice you were waiting to say something. Would you like to? Yes, I mean, whatever you'd like to contribute would be welcome.
Well, firstly, I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions. Very, very good. Thank you.
Oh dear, we seem
to follow on from. Are you okay? Can you hear me?
It's not brilliant, but carry on.
One of the things that Franta always said to me was the fact that he would only look forward. He always just looked forward. His experience in the war was such, and what happened to his family, that he pretty much shut all that away and decided that he was going to live for the moment and only look forward. So it definitely spurred him on to achieve and work to create a legacy almost. And Mum was work for her was just fundamentally, it was part of her being. It almost didn't matter whether the work sold. What was important was the fact that the work was created. So I'm very, very proud of both of them, and it's a fantastic legacy, and it's wonderful that people appreciate the work still. Thank you.
That's a lovely note at which to end. Thank you very much, Stefan. Absolutely. And perhaps actually just one parting shot. It's also, I think, you know, what we've heard today is also a very vivid reminder of what a crucial part non-British soldiers played in the Allied victory in the Second World War. So that's a whole other aspect that mustn't be forgotten. Very good. So I think
very much so.
Yes, indeed. Good. I'll say goodbye again. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and keep safe and be well. All right. All the best.
Thank you very much. Bye.